Alright, talking about square roots. When we're talking about square roots, obviously we're talking about something like the square root of 4. Okay? We have our square root sign, which is called the radical. They call it square root sign. Okay, let's call it radical sign. Okay, those are two main things you'll see a lot of the times. Now, understand that it is a square root sign when it looks like that, but this sign can also look like that. Okay, that would be the cubed root. In other words, what number times itself 3 times would be the answer. So, for example, if I was doing this, the cube root of 27, okay, well, what number times itself 3 times would equal 27? No, you're not listening to what I'm saying. Stop. What number times itself? No. So you are taking and dividing it by 3. You don't do that. It's 3. 3 times 3 times 3 would be 27. So the cubed root of 27 is 3. Just like you have a tendency, when they don't show a number here, it's always 2. But you have a tendency, for example, if I was to give you the square root of 256, a lot of times you just cut it in half or divide it by 2. Well, that's not what I'm saying. That's not what that says. It says what number times itself equals the given number under the radical sign. Now, in the first example, yes, the square root of 4 is 2. So it's like, I'm dividing by 2. No, you're not. You're just 2 times 2 is 4. Okay, it just happened to be that 4 has the answer that's halfway in. It's the only one that does. Okay, the square root of 16 is not 8. Okay, square root of 36 is not 18. Okay, so it's not what number you multiply 2 by to get your number, but it's whatever number times itself equals that number. Okay, now we're going to talk about square roots today, but I wanted you to understand that a radical sign can have any number out there on it, and what it's saying is like when we talked about the cubed root, it's what number times itself 3 times would equal 27. Okay, so let's say we had the square root of 16. Square root of 16 is 4. Now, this is where it's a little bit different. We talked about it a little bit last year. Well, not a little bit, probably quite a bit. But there's another square root of 16 besides 4. What is the other? If you think you know it, raise your hand so I don't have to hear all the wrong answers. Okay. If you think you know what the other square root of 16 would be, raise your hand. Besides 4. And it's not 8, it's not 2, it's not, okay? Madison. So 1 times 1 is 4, or 1 times 1 is 16. Then how could it be 1? You guessed, obviously. Square root of 1 is 1, so 1 squared has to be 1. What? Yeah, it's negative 4. Because negative 4 times negative 4 would be positive 16. Okay? So that is the answer to the square root of 16. Okay, we put the plus minus sign in front of it. We talked about that last year, but the book last year would say, what are the 2 square roots of the number? This year they're just going to ask you for the square root of the number. When they ask you for the square root of the number, then you must put plus or minus 4 or plus or minus 7, whatever it is. For example, the square root of 49. Square root of 49 would be plus or minus 7. We don't put it on top of the square root sign. Okay? We don't do this. That is not the answer to that problem. Okay? This is not the answer to that problem. Okay? The answer to the problem is plus or minus 7. Not 7 squared. Like I said, it's not on top of the square root sign like this. Okay? That would be more of the acceptable version. Just put it underneath and circle it plus or minus 7. Okay, so that's what the square root is. It's what number times itself would equal the given number underneath the square root sign or the radical sign. Okay, now, we've talked about this for the last, well, I know 6th and 7th grade here because I've taught you this. We've talked about having our perfect squares. Let's see, am I off 31? That's off 225. It's 256. It's 256 there. Then that, yeah, it's 289. That's where I was off. I knew it was off somewhere. Okay. Now, it is always good to have those memorized. Okay. So on the test, you're not going to be allowed to use a calculator. And so I would, me personally, I would have those memorized. Now, one thing that you need to understand is here we have 1 times 1. Because 11 times 11, in other words, if I took 11 times 11, that's going to be 1, carry nothing, 1, bring down my 0, 1, 1. So that's going to be 121. Since I multiplied by 1s, then my number ends in a 1. If I take 12 times 12, it's going to be 144. Okay, well 22 times 22 is also going to end in a 4. Okay, 23 times 23 is going to end in a 9. So the way that these end here, the 3 and the 9, the 4 and the 6, the 5 and the 5, the 6 and the 6, the 7 and the 9, the 8 and the 4, the 9 and the 1, those will always be the case. I can take 119 times 119, and that whatever that is, it's going to end in a 1 every single time. Okay? And I say that because in a minute we're going to have to get some bigger square roots that we don't know, that we're going to have to sort of estimate what they are. To do that, you're going to need to know that, just like 6 squared. Right here, 6 squared ends in a 6, 16 squared ends in a 6. 26 squared is going to end in a 6. 36 squared is going to end in a 6. 46 squared is going to end in a 6. Okay? Every single time. So that will help you understand that when you're dealing with perfect squares. Now, this only works if it is a perfect square. Okay? I'm going to show you one here in a second that's not a perfect square, that they want you to approximate it to see, whether it's close to this number or close to this number. Now, let's look at this one. Let's say I've got the square root of 10. And it says approximate it to the nearest integer. Okay, remember our integers are our negative and positive counting numbers. So, let me see if they're going to want, yeah, they don't. So they don't do it on that one, and they expect you to know it. But they want you to approximate it to the nearest integer. Okay? Well, what is it closest to? No, the square root of 10 is going to be 10. No, see, you're doing it again. You're cutting the number in half. Square root is not cutting the number in half or dividing by 2. Okay, integer, as I just stated, y'all wake up, please. Integer is a counting number. So if you count by 3.5, then I guess that would be a good estimate. But you don't count by 3.5. You count by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Those are all counting numbers because I count by them. Okay, so I want a whole number, an integer. Square root of 2, the square root of 4 is 2. Okay, if you'll let me talk, if you'll let me continue on, I'll give you what I'm trying to say here, okay? But when you interrupt with an answer that's not even correct, anyway, the square root of 4 is 2. So obviously, we're not looking for the square root of 4, we're looking for the square root of 10. The next one up would be the square root of 9. So you can't say it's 2 because it's not close to 2. Okay? The square root of 9 is 3. Is the square root of 9 and the square root of 10 close together? Yes, it is. So, the approximation for the square root of 10 to the nearest integer would be 3. Okay? Since you're approximating it, you do not have to use the plus or minus. You can just put 3. Okay? The reason we put 3 and not 4, okay? Here's the reason. The square root of 10 falls between the square root of 9 and the square root of 16. That's what it falls between. The square root of 9 is 3. The square root of 16 is 4. Well, then we just look at, is 10 closer to 9 or is 10 closer to 16? It's closer to 9. So therefore, approximating to the nearest integer, it would have to be 3 would be the approximate for the square root of 10. Let's say they gave us the square root of 15. Well, it's still the same. The same 2 square roots is where this falls. It still falls between the square root of 9 and the square root of 16. So it still is an approximation of 3 and 4. Okay, is it closer, is the square root of 15 closer to the square root of 16 or the square root of 9? Square root of 16. So therefore, our estimate or approximation for this one would be the square root of 15 would be closest to 4. Okay, so that's when they tell you to approximate. Now, the ones they're going to give you are going to be harder than that. Okay, but it's still the same. Let's say they said the square root of 148. Okay, well, the square root of 148 is close to the square root of 144 and the square root of 169.
Why didn't you use 11?
What is 11 squared? What is 12 squared? So why would I use a number that Okay, because 148 falls between 144 and 169, not 121 and 144, right? Okay, that's why I used that one. Okay, because it's what falls in between. 148 is in between 144 and 169. Now, what we have to look at, and it gets harder as the numbers get bigger, is we have to look at 169 minus 148. Well, that's 21. So 148 is 21 away from 169. 148 minus 144 is 4. So it's obviously closer to 144. So therefore, the approximation to the nearest integer for 148 would be 12. Okay, now, where that would change is if we had, for example, 150. The square root of 150. Okay, well, the square root of 150 is almost in the middle between the two, but if we subtract it out, that would be 19, and we take 140, we take 150, I didn't want to go 150, excuse me, I wanted to go 155. Okay, if we take 145 and subtract 144 from it, that gives me 11. So the square root of 155 is still closer to 12 than it is 13, because 155 is closer to 144 than it is 169. Okay, so that's how you can tell which one it's closer to. If you can't just, a lot of them are going to be easy. You can know it's 4 away from this one and it's 20 away from this one. Well, that's easy to tell, you know, what the approximation should be. Okay, but that's what they're talking about when they tell you to approximate it to the nearest integer. Now, the next thing they're going to talk about is taking the square root, or doing this. X squared is equal to 49. Okay? And they want to know how we solve, this is a quadratic equation, how we solve the quadratic equation, because it has exponents. Okay? Well, to solve that, you just simply take the square root of both sides. Okay? The square root of x squared is x. Because what letter times itself would give you x squared? X times x. So x is it. Square root of 49 plus or minus 7. Now, that's not real hard. Okay? Obviously, they're going to get harder. Okay? Let me look at one here. Okay? Y squared equals 676. Now, here's where it becomes a little bit more difficult, but you've got to use what I talked about when we were doing this up here with the circles here and here. This is when you've got to use that. Okay? Y squared equals 676. Okay? Well, that means I got to do the square root of y squared and the square root of 676. Square root of y squared is y. The square root of 676. That's what I've got to simplify. Okay? Here's how I simplify it. The square root of 676 falls between these two. The square root of 400 and the square root of 900. That's what it falls between. What is the square root of 400? 20. What is the square root of 900? 30. So, then that tells me that my answer, since this is right in between those two, it tells me that my answer has to be somewhere in there. Okay? Now, it ends in a 6. Okay? So the two numbers down here that are going to end in a 6 is 24 times 24 and 26 times 26. Reason I don't look at these is because that ends in a 1, that ends in a 4, that ends in a 9, that ends in a 5, that ends in a 9, that ends in a 4, that ends in a 1. So if it is a perfect square, which they didn't tell me it was necessarily, but if it is a perfect square, it has to be one of these two numbers. So, unfortunately, when you get to something like 24 or 26 or 34 and 36 or 44 and 46, you just got to multiply it out and see which one it is. So you got to go over here and check it. 24 times 24, that would be 6, carry my 1, 9, bring down a 0, 8, 4, that's going to be 6, 17, carry my 1, 576. So let's try 26 times 26. That'd be 6, carry my 3, 6 times 2 is 12, plus 3 would be 15. Bring down my 0, that would be 2, carry my 1, 5. 676. So the square root of 676, so x equals plus or minus 26. That's your answer. Now, let's say I did that. Let's say I did this. Looks like most of them, yeah, okay. Let's say I had c squared is equal to 125. Okay, well, to solve it, I take the square root of both sides. Square root of c squared is c. The square root of 125. Well, is the square root of 125 a perfect square? No. Didn't. So, they told me to approximate it to the nearest tenth. Okay? They told me to approximate it to the nearest tenth. Well, here's what you do. We know that the square root of 125 is between the square root of 121, which is 11, and the square root of 144, which is 12. So if I'm going to approximate it to the nearest tenth, that means it has to be one of these numbers. And it's not showing up. Hopefully it'll catch up to me. Basically, I took 11.1 to 11.9. So I wrote out 11.1, 11.2, 11.3, 11.4. There it is. Okay. So it has to be one of those numbers. Okay? How we're going to decide which one it is 125. Is 125 closer to 121 or closer to 144? It's closer to 121. So I'm going to try those two numbers. I am going to experiment with those two numbers. So I'm going to come down here and say, okay, 11.2 times 11.2. That would be 4, 2, 2, take down my 0, 2, 1, 1, bring down 2 zeros, 2, 1, 1. So it's 4, 452. So that's 125.44. So is that over or is that less? It's over, right? So it could be this, but we know now that it won't be 11.3. We can mark that one out because 11.2 was too much. So let's try 11.1. That would be 1, 1, 1. That would be 1, 2, 3, 2, 1. So 123.11. 0.21, excuse me. So which is closer, 125.44 or 123.21? Yeah. So that tells me then that the square C is equal to plus or minus 11.2. That would be your answer, approximating it to the nearest tenth. So let's say we have one like this. Let's say make it a little harder, and we have 5y squared equals 110. Well, if that was 5y equal 110, what would I do to solve it? By 5. So we do the same thing. Same process applies. We divide by 5 to both sides. That would give me y squared is equal to 22. Well, is 22 a perfect square? No. So I have to take the square root of that, square root of that. So that gives me y is equal to the square root of 22. Okay, this is where you start getting yourself in trouble and you'll say 11. No, it's not 11. The square root of 22 is not 11. Okay, we're not dividing by 2. We do, however, know that the square root of 22 is going to fall between the square root of 16 and the square root of 25. That's what it's going to fall between. Square root of 16 is 4. Square root of 25 is 5. So that tells me that it's either going to be 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, 4.4, 4.5, 4.6, 4.7, 4.8, 4.9. But we want to get closer than just knowing those 10 numbers. So, is 22 closer to 25 or closer to 16? Closer to 25. So I'm going to be at the upper end. I'm going to say 4.8 times 4.8, and I'm going to say 4.7 times 4.7. So that's 8, be 64. 8 times 4 is 32, plus 6 be 38. Bring down my 0. 4 times 8 is 32. 4 times 4 is 16, plus 3 to be 19. That gives me 4032, 23.04. Okay, that's too much, but it's still fairly close. Now let's try 4.7. 7 times 7 is 9, carry my 4. 7 times 4 is 28, plus 4 would be 32. Bring down my 0. 4 times 7 is 28, carry my 2. 4 times 4 is 16, plus 2 would be 18. Be 9, 0, carry my 1. Be 2, carry my 1, 22.09. So that's it. That's as close as you're going to get. Okay, so that means y is equal to plus or minus 4.7. If you don't have the plus or minus, it will be wrong. All right, so that would solve an equations. Now, there is a section in here where they're going to say, okay, the square root, the negative square root of 33. Okay? And they're going to tell you that you can use a calculator, and they want you to approximate it to the nearest tenth. So I'm going to allow you to do that. It's against my better judgment. But, so we take 33 and take the square root of it. Okay? Now, if we round it to the nearest tenth, what's that going to be? Round it to the nearest tenth. 5.7. So, it would be negative 5.7. Now, understand this. Only use a calculator where they say you can. On solving the equations, you can't use a calculator. Okay? Now, understand this. You can't have the square root of negative 49. That is not possible. Okay? The square root of negative 49 is not possible. The reason being is because there is no number times itself that would equal negative 49. In other words, I can't do that because that's 49. I can't do this because that's positive 49. And I can't do this because that's not the same number as that. They're opposites of each other. Okay? So, understand that, know that. All right. Last thing. Square root of A minus B, where A is equal to 48, B is equal to 12. So you just plug those in. So you have the square root of 48 minus 12. Square root of 48 minus 12. Square root of 48 minus 12 is 36. So the square root of 36 is 6. No. Now, your homework. (16 through 52 even). Okay, you can go.